thank you for tuning in to Chrontendo episode 15. We're going to start this episode off right where we left off. Chrontendo episode 14 ended with Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. We're going to start with another sequel to a big, huge Japanese hit. Yep, it's Dragon Quest II, a game that sold a few million copies in Japan. Heck, this is practically a special RPG episode because we now see Konami enter the RPG ring with their own game, Esper Dream. And of course there's the usual selection of weird, miscellaneous, and bizarre Japanese titles. And by the way, if you like Chrontendo, make sure you check out our companion series, Chron Sega, the first episode of which was just released. Chron Sega will be covering the Sega Master System in chronological order. Also, I apologize in advance for the excessive length of the Dragon Quest II coverage, but I guess I had a lot to say about that game. We kick off this episode with a huge release, and what is probably the biggest, longest, and most ambitious release for the Famicom yet, Enix's Dragon Quest II. The first Dragon Quest game, released in May 1986, was a big hit in Japan, and Enix and developer Chunsoft somehow managed to get this sequel out 9 months later. The game was eventually released in the US in 1990 as Dragon Warrior 2, with a snazzy new title screen, title scroll explaining the plot, and a new expository introductory sequence. The original Japanese version began with a wounded soldier entering the king's chamber room. Still, the story of Dragon Quest II is almost told entirely in-game, rather than in-manual, as was the case of most video games at this point. For example, the Zelda games. In this case, you can never have actually read the manual and still pretty much fully understand the story. This is something that's true of most games nowadays, but back in the 8-bit days, usually only RPGs tried to tell the story in the game itself. Something to consider is that back in 1987, video game sequels for console games were not really that common. Zelda 2, for example, which we saw last episode and was released only about a week prior to this game, made the mistake of altering the basic formula of Legend of Zelda, removing a lot of the things that made Zelda so memorable, and not really replacing them with anything as compelling. And this right here is the point where the original Japanese game begins. Now, Dragon Quest II, on the other hand, is a perfect example of how to do a sequel right. Expand on the original game and add new interesting gameplay elements. They add more content to the game and fix some of the flaws that hindered the original. Dragon Quest II is very similar to Dragon Quest, but bigger and better in every way. As before, you begin in your home castle, with the most basic equipment and a little bit of cash. Each town is filled with NPCs, shops, and an inn. Not to mention those tantalizing locked doors and treasure chests. You won't be able to open them until much later in the game. However, you now have a specific goal, rather than just defeating the bad guy. Find your cousins, the Prince of Kanuk and the Princess of Moonbrook. Just like in Dragon Quest I, you walk around on the overworld and face random battles for experience and gold. Here is the game's ubiquitous slimes. They're always the first enemies you encounter in pretty much every Dragon Quest game. One thing, Dragon Quest II has removed the little backgrounds that appear behind enemies and replaced them with these plain black screens. Not really sure why that is. Now first of all, you're looking for the Prince of Kanuk. In his castle you'll find he's not there, and rather amusingly his sister tells you he travels slowly. This turns out to be completely false, as you'll end up chasing him all over the continent. Whenever you go where you hear he's headed, it turns out he's already left. Another nice little feature of Dragon Quest II, you can save in castles other than the beginning castle. In fact, you can save in almost any castle or town. Now this all brings us up to the major innovation of Dragon Quest II. You control a party of 3 characters rather than just 1, as in the first Dragon Quest, and pretty much every other Japanese RPG up to this point. I finally caught up to the prince here in an inn. Dragon Quest's main inspiration, Ultima 3, standardized a party of 4 characters, as would many future Japanese RPGs. Unfortunately, the prince comes equipped with very low abilities and very bad armor and weapons. and of course you have to buy everything for him. The princess is a little trickier to find. She's been transformed in this dog hair, which follows you around when you talk to it. That's the clue. And you need to find a certain magical item to break the spell. Once a new party member has joined your team, you will be horrified to learn they actually start at level 1, and are pretty much completely useless at first. Later on, Japanese RPGs would adopt a convention where new characters are already kind of leveled up when you meet them. Sometimes they're actually more powerful than the other members of your party. However, in this game, the characters are pretty worthless, and you'll be desperately trying to prevent them from being killed in every single battle. However, once these guys have gained a few levels, they do get pretty useful as they can cast magic, unlike your main character, and in particular healing spells as well as status and attack spells. Whereas in Dragon Quest I you fought enemies one-on-one, in this game you face an entire row of enemies. Obviously this adds an entirely new element to the battle. Fighting enemies in Dragon Quest I mostly consisted of trading blows until one of you ran out of HP. Dragon Quest II uses what would become the standard Japanese RPG mode of battle, using your stronger characters to attack the enemy while the weaker characters focus on support and magic. In Dragon Quest II you can choose which group of enemies to attack, but not a specific member of that group. So if attacked by a group of strong monsters, you can't focus on taking that one at a time. Your characters seem to attack enemies at random. Conversely, you can't have Edgar and Gwen gang up on one enemy while your main character kills off the rest by himself. This would of course become a standard tactic when playing Japanese RPGs later. By this stage, Gwen has learned a stronger offensive spell, Infernos, which can attack every enemy in the group rather than just one. Later spells will damage all enemies on the screen. This particular sequence of spells, early spells targeting only one individual, while later more powerful spells target a group, would become standard policy in Japanese RPGs to this very day. And of course, enemies in Dragon Quest II use a variety of horrible status spells. Eventually, you'll seem to come to sort of a dead end, with nothing left to explore, and then suddenly you acquire a ship. Suddenly the entire world opens up to you, and the world of Dragon Quest II is much larger than that of the previous game. In fact, the entire world of Dragon Quest I is part of this game as one of several continents. We just landed on it right here. We can even visit the castle from the first game, as well as the Dragon Lord's castle. You can see it right there in the little swamp. The guy who refills your magic for free is even still around. However, most of the towns seem to have disappeared. And Dragon Quest II is a literal sequel to Dragon Quest I. It takes place apparently hundreds of years later, and you're some sort of descendant of the guy from the first game. Aside from improved battle and a bigger world, there are quite a few other things that have changed in Dragon Quest II. The NPCs and side quests are more interesting. This king, for example, wants you to fight a monster in his arena. The interface is less clunky, no more using a menu to go upstairs, for example, and you no longer have to use a torch to see inside a dungeon. But the dungeons and towers in this game are much trickier to find your way around in. They're full of multiple paths, dead ends, trapdoors that take you down to lower floors, all kinds of strange areas that you have to sort of find a particular exit to get out of, otherwise you'll keep sort of roaming around and around in circles. And there's actually a much greater variety of enemies, quite a few which are very colorful. Altogether, I think there are around 75 or so as compared to the 35 or 40 in the first game, as well as more items and spells, around 22 spells compared to Dragon Quest IX. Eventually there is less time spent walking around in one place trying to gain levels. The game is also more non-linear and puzzle-like. At least what you are doing is not always spelled out for you. Here, for example, I'm looking for the gold key, something you need to get into all those red doors, and it's not that easy to find. This dog has actually buried it. What you're mostly doing once you actually find the boat and sail out into the world, well, you can explore around all you want, but eventually it turns out that your main goal is to find these 5 crests, and of course you'll need items in order to find those, such as the gold key and also the jailer's key. Unlike Dragon Quest I, keys are reusable, but they're pretty hard to find, and they're sort of hidden, as I mentioned earlier, kind of randomly around the world. For example, this town right here, actually you need the gold key to get inside of it. This particular town sells some of the most powerful armor and weapons in the game, but they're quite expensive as you can see here. I only have around $10,000 at this moment. However, as it turns out, the best armor and weapons in this game are generally found rather than bought. This guy here will tell you how to make the best armor for Gwen, and of course you've got to go all over the world looking for the ingredients, and then you've got to find the guy to make it. And none of this is exactly spelled out clearly in the game itself. So once you get the jailer's key, you're able to open up the little doors that look like prison bars. Of course, I've encountered these in many towns and castles, and the guys inside will give you various clues or hints or important items, all that sort of thing. Here are sort of some mid-bosses, these two Oswargs. They're similar to monsters you faced before, but much more powerful. Just like a lot of early games, Dragon Quest II uses a lot of sprites with palette swaps. So what all this boils down to is that Dragon Quest II is much more non-linear than the first game. In Dragon Quest I, you pretty much followed a path around the continents, looking for items and whatnot. In this game, once you get the ship, there's really no sort of set order in which you visit the towns. The monsters in some areas are more difficult than others, but you can pretty much sail around anywhere you want, just sort of looking to random towns and castles for clues. Eventually, of course, it'll all sort of come together. Also returning this game are the famous metal slimes, which have much higher experience if you kill them, but of course they're very hard to kill. This also introduces the metal babble to the game, which is tougher and yields around 1,000 experience points. Very good for early to middle in the game. Now certainly in Dragon Quest II, a greater variety of level design has been introduced. It has the now standard fire world, for example, full of dangerous lava and tough enemies. You are looking for a statue that is required to open up the path to Hargon's lair. Now eventually, of course, in these sorts of games, as well as platformers, the fire level and the ice level would become quite common. Oddly enough, another game we're seeing this episode, Esper Worlds, has an ice world in it. Now while this game is certainly a big improvement over the first one, there are some kind of annoying factors. One of them is the general underpowering of magic. You have healing magic, but it doesn't really heal that much, and magic tends to run out pretty quickly. Certain enemies, such as the puppets, will do a strange jig, which will shave 12 to 30 MP points. I've seen as high as 35, and this can quickly drain your MP. This can often lead to utter disaster. Once in one of the towers, I encountered a group of enemies, including 3 puppets, that immediately stole all of my remaining magic, thus leaving me with pretty much no healing abilities, or even enough magic to warp outside the tower. There aren't really any items to restore your magic, other than the rare and rather unreliable wizard rings. You'll find Gwen's magic spells are not very good in the offensive department, only dispensing around 20 to 30 points of damage. As you get midway in the game, encountering enemies that have 50 to 90 hit points, Gwen just can't take out enemies fast enough to do much good. Now at this point you're encountering some of the more dangerous enemies in the game, including these blizzards that can cast a spell called Defeat on your entire party, and which will sometimes get lucky and kill 1 or 2 party members in one go. The giants will occasionally deal around 125 points of damage with one attack, which can kill one character instantly. And here of course you can see how frequently your magic spells can miss. The powerful ones like Explodette are good when they hit, but sometimes only hitting 1 or even none of the enemies will happen to you. Getting wiped out is very easy in this level, and you will have to do some major grinding in order to make it all the way to the end of the game. And believe it or not, there's actually these villains called Batboons, which can cast a spell called Sacrifice, which simply kills off your entire party. And you'll be using healing magic constantly on this last level. At one point, after leaving the last save point and venturing towards the final castle, Gwen had used almost 2/3 of her magic after literally traveling 6 steps. My blizzards had here killed 2 party members, and the odds are definitely not good, so I had to run. Remember, of course, sometimes you can't run, and this will often result in death for your party. Luckily, you can restore your party for free at this shrine. Now at times, Dragon Quest can be much more creative than earlier RPGs. For example, when you reach Hargon's castle, you mysteriously find yourself inside your home castle. This is sort of a surprising moment, and you'll need the Charm of Rubis, which you traded in the 5 crests for, in order to clear the illusion. There is an inn which you can heal at, which seems nice, but once the illusion is dispelled, your HP and MP revert back to what they were before you previously found the real Hargan's castle. Now once you're inside the castle itself, you'll need to move up a few flights of stairs, some of which are pretty difficult to find, and face 3 bosses before fighting Hargan himself. This is sort of an early example of a boss rush, I guess, and there's also one last boss. We'll be seeing the end of the game here, and I don't know if a spoiler warning should be required on a 20-year-old video game, but if you've been putting off playing this game for the last 2 decades, consider yourself warned. While you do have opportunities to heal before battles, these last guys, like Atlas here, are pretty tough, and odds are you will get killed a few times. In fact, you'll probably be killed frequently in Dragon Quest II, and not always fairly. These old-school RPGs generally show no mercy, and a little bad luck is all it takes. The sleep spells are one of the worst offenders, and it's not that uncommon for your entire party to be put to sleep before you have a chance to even make one move. Combining sleep-casting enemies with monsters that can do a lot of damage can spell doom for your entire party. You might also wish that Esker and Gwen were a little stronger. Our hero can take a lot of punishment, but your other 2 characters have weaker defense and can't equip good armor or weapons. It seems they spend much time simply casting heal on themselves, and unlike a lot of later RPGs, like the Final Fantasy games, they never get any really powerful spells. So your hero definitely does most of the heavy lifting, fighting-wise. If a character does get killed, only Esker can revive them, and they only have 1 hit point. The only other way is to use a World Tree Leaf, and you can only get that leaf in one particular island. Inventory space is limited and will mostly be taken up by armor, weapons, keys, quest items, etc., so you can't exactly stock up on healing items, and there's no way to completely restore your party's health or magic. And a spell that would heal all the characters at once would have been nice as well. Now here we finally come to Hargan, and he is of course the fake final boss. He's a little tough, but not that bad. Once you defeat him, he'll then give you the real final boss, which of course is even more difficult. The main bad guy is one of those physical embodiment of evil types. Another video game cliche. And this guy has a lot of hit points and can completely heal himself with the Heal All spell. It's actually quite annoying. Now once you've defeated him, unlike most games this era, Dragon Quest II doesn't simply end. You'll find yourself in a monsterless world full of happy NPCs. Returning to your home castle will get you crowned king, and then the game will end. So Dragon Quest II is far from perfect, but certainly the best JRPG to have come out so far, and surprisingly playable today. And I suppose it is an important marker in the history of the genre. JRPGs were now headed down a completely different path than Western computer RPGs. Around this time, a new generation of US-made role-playing games, Bard's Tale, Might and Magic, and so on were coming out, but these games were much more Dungeons & Dragons orientated, based in a standard sword and sorcery fantasy world, and focusing more on stats and heavy blocks of text. The Dragon Quest games were much more video gamey and quirky, and most Japanese RPGs would follow the template set by this game. While Dragon Quest does take place in a medieval world, the villains and enemies really aren't sort of your standard trolls and orcs and that sort of thing. And there's even a bit of a science fiction element with robots thrown in. I'm sure a lot of this had to do with Akira Toriyama's designs, and remember that he was extremely famous in Japan at this time, and his name may have really helped the popularity of Dragon Quest II. For whatever reason, Dragon Quest II sold around 2.5 million copies in Japan and inspired an even better sequel. Well, Dragon Quest II throws a pretty long shadow over this episode, and we're now going to have to deal with some of the less epic releases. For example, the first of 3 Bandai titles this episode. Bandai is definitely nothing if not prolific. Ultraman, Kaijuu Teikoku no Gyakushuu is, I think, the first Ultraman game, and certainly the first for the Famicom. I don't know who developed this game, but it was perhaps some other contract developer besides Tosa. But don't worry, Toza fans, we will actually see a Toza title a little bit later this episode. I assume most everyone out there is familiar with Ultraman. This was the popular 60s Japanese television show, which falls into what we call the Kaijuu genre. In the US, we might call this the giant monster genre. There have been countless sequels and spin-offs to the original Ultraman series, like such as Ultraman 80, Ultraman Leo, Ultra Q, and so on. But I don't think there was an Ultraman TV show being produced when this game came out, so this release is rather uncharacteristic of the normally very tie-in oriented Bandai. As I'm sure you've already noticed, the Ultraman game is basically a run, jump, and shoot scrolling platformer. Really nothing spectacular on display here, but it is a hell of a lot better than that Transformers Convoy no Nazo game, so we should be grateful for that. You start off each level as what is presumably Shin, Ultraman's human alter ego. After collecting those little glowing power spheres to fill the meter in the upper right, you can transform into Ultraman. And this is really the only interesting feature of this game. This game is somewhat sloppily produced. You'll notice a few things here, for example. Oops. Not quite landing on the mountain there. And for some reason, it's extremely difficult to actually pick up that particular power sphere as it's sort of embedded in the mountainside. Eventually I'll figure it out. Now once you've obtained that sphere, as I mentioned, you can transform into Ultraman and do battle with the end of level boss. As Ultraman you lose your layer firing capabilities, but you can sort of do hand-to-hand combat. Now this isn't exactly a fighting game, so you pretty much just hit him over and over again with your arm chop. Oddly, sometimes hits register when the boss's head is open and unprotected, and other times they don't. And great, now we're on to level 2. The scale of this game is actually kind of weird. You are supposed to be a normal human-sized person in this form, but you're actually enormous in relationship to those buildings. So Ultraman is not really a game for the ages, it's just another quickie title from Bandai. It's, I suppose, playable, but you probably won't think too highly of it. From our good buddies HAL Laboratories, it's Eggerland, and Eggerland is one of 2 HAL games this episode, and clearly this is the game that was closest to HAL's heart. HAL's typical attention to detail and dedication to quality are immediately apparent from this rather catchy musical theme, not to mention the rather long expository opening sequence. This is actually pretty darn impressive. These kind of openings were pretty unusual in console games at this time. Just think back to Zelda 2 from last episode, just a pretty simple little title screen and text scroll. Here basically we see the whole plot of the game kind of detailed out in animation. And that part right there where he flies away to his castle is pretty cool as well. HAL's Gal Force also had a very long intro, but of course the game itself was completely terrible. Now with Eggerland, HAL is in pretty comfortable territory since this is actually the 3rd Eggerland release. There had been 2 earlier games released for MSX computers in 1985 and 1986. Eggerland for the FDS is somewhat confusingly a modified port of Eggerland 2 for the MSX. Japanese gamers must have had a pretty strong appetite for Sokoban-type puzzle games in the 1980s, since a total of 5 games for the FDS or Famicom would be released in Japan, not to mention 1 US-only title, The Adventures of Lolo. So Eggerland is sort of the Mega Man of puzzle games. Now, in Eggerland, you control the rather rotund Prince Lolo, who is typically rescuing his girlfriend. This is done by navigating through a series of interconnected rooms. Since the rooms have locked doors, you'll need to obtain keys found in the locked chests. The chests can be opened by collecting all the hearts in each room. As per Sokoban rules, you can push boxes but are unable to pull them for some never-explained reason. Lolo, as we saw a second ago, also has the ability to fire a very limited number of magic shots, which will temporarily transform an enemy into a harmless egg. Now, you have to be very careful in this game, otherwise a simple little mistake can make a level unsolvable, as you actually saw there just a second ago. I pushed one box just a little too far, and got myself stuck. Now, exiting and re-entering a room will reset the boxes, so you can usually find your way out of the mess, though of course it doesn't work if you're on the first room like I was there. And this is basically how the game goes for 122 rooms. And of course you occasionally have to be clever, like for example using the eggs to cross the little rivers there. There really isn't too much timing required, though occasionally you do have to be quick. It's more of a matter of just trying to figure out how exactly to push those darn boxes around. And sometimes when you grab the last heart, enemies will come to life and kill you, like just happened to me there. Now, one thing about this game is there's often multiple doors in each room, so you'd have to, when you open the doors, you don't always know what the best door to walk out through is. Now again, a second ago I mentioned enemies coming to life. This is another level where you have to be careful. Those guys will start breathing fire as soon as you grab the last box, so you want to push the blocks around to actually block that. Normally that guy in the top middle section there would kill you if you tried to walk past him while he was breathing fire. Now right now I've entered a room that I actually could have entered earlier from the lower left-hand door, but the room is pretty much unsolvable from that direction. If you enter from the top like I did here a second ago, you'll be able to push the blocks around and block the enemies. Again, this game isn't so much about timing as it is about sort of carefully planning out which way you're going to go. Really, there's a lot of trial and error in Eggerland. I'm going to say that overall, Eggerland is probably a bit more complex and challenging than your typical Sokoban style game. Probably one of the better puzzle games of this type that have been released on the Famicom so far. So for fans of this particular style of games, the old school puzzle games that didn't involve trying to match up colored objects that were falling down, definitely this game is worth your while. Well, Black Bass certainly takes the cake for the most inexplicable cover and title screen. Not to mention one of the most hideous musical themes for the Famicom. You might assume this is the original Japanese version of the US game, also called Black Bass, or rather Black Bass USA, but once the game itself starts, you will see that no, this is a completely different game. Sort of like Fist of the North Star, it was actually the sequel to this game, Black Bass 2, that was released in the US. The premise is similar to the later, more familiar game. Choose a lure, pick a spot out on the lake, and then cast your line. Once your line is cast, use your D-pad to wiggle the lure and then carefully reel the fish in. Reeling too quickly will break the line. The general layout of the main screen reminds me a lot of Nintendo's old golf game. Coincidentally, Nintendo will be releasing a new golf game a little later in February 1987. Now, Black Bass is not the most pleasant looking game, from that horrible checkerboard border on the main screen to the physically impossible looking arc the fishing line moves in when you cast. Everything in this game shows a general lack of taste. So it's not surprising the publisher of this game has one of the worst names in video game history. Hot B. As I recall, the name actually means something perfectly logical. The B doesn't stand for bass, and Hot B is still a very poorly considered name. They eventually changed the name to Starfish. This is their first game for the Famicom, and as far as I know, they're still around making games. Here we are trying to reel in the fish. Note your line is not visible, and it's actually pretty easy to reel too quickly and have the line break. But I can't help but wonder, what exactly is your character supposed to be wearing? Now, I wouldn't consider Black Bass to be a good game, but it did set the stage for the entire fishing and hunting games subgenre, much more so than Duck Hunt, especially in the way that it tries to somewhat accurately recreate the act of fishing. While, serious gamers and critics usually don't have much use for these games, fishing and hunting games still exist as a reasonably successful subgenre of sports games. Our third Famicom Disk System game this episode is from the ever-baffling Sunsoft. Nazoler Land is what we might call a magazine release. We'll discuss what that means in just a moment. Note the dual copyright with Seikai Bunkasha, a Japanese publishing house. Incidentally, the art and character design are by an established Japanese cartoonist named Nanjin, though I don't think he's really known in the West. You don't really see magazine releases for video game consoles anymore, but they were somewhat common at one point, usually for computer systems. The cartridges usually had an issue number on them and came out on a semi-regular basis. For example, the next Nazoler Land game came out in June. And they generally contain several small games, plus some additional non-game material. The closest we've seen to this so far for the Famicom was those educational games from Tokyo Sosheki that were released back in 1986. Now the name Nazoler Land indicates the games will be puzzle-orientated, and this one right here is probably the most interesting, a sort of clever little maze game with revolving doors. You can actually push your way through a door as long as the door is able to move. For example, instance where the one of the limbs sort of is blocked by a brick wall, you won't be able to open the door. Note the character's sort of similarity to Pac-Man here. This game is probably not really enormously original, and not too much effort was put into it, but I guess it's decent compared to some of the other stuff. No idea how many levels are actually in this thing. The next one is actually sort of a code word game. You try to guess the correct sequence of icons. In this case, the icons are all astrological signs. Entering in a sequence will tell you how many icons are correct, that's the number of empty stars, and how many are correct and in the right position, the number of solid stars. Through trial and error, you can eventually find the correct sequence. For example, 1 is in the right spot in the first line there. One of the icons is correct but in the incorrect spot on the second line. Here I'm getting closer and closer. Have 3 correct icons. And just through guessing I'll eventually find what the 4th one is. Again, this is not really that exciting of a game. And actually nothing on this cartridge is really that great. The presentation is really not that impressive, but I guess at least games like Nazoler Land and Black Bass show that game makers were trying to get creative and experimenting with different types of releases. Oh, also on here there's like this jigsaw puzzle. There's a very simple first-person dungeon type game, and then a first-person maze game. I guess the point of all this was just for publishers to try to determine what exactly the Japanese public would buy. Remember, of course, the Famicom was very popular, but still, there wasn't really much of a video game market before the release. Some were computers, but they were still trying to figure things out. So on the cheaper Famicom Disk System releases, they could actually do some weird stuff like this. And we'll see a lot of this on the FDS, just sort of off the wall, but not entirely successful releases. Oh, Hudson Soft, what have you done? This is Shin Jinrui, sometimes called Shin Jinrui, the new type. This title was developed by Hudson and curiously published by Rixsoft. Who is Rixsoft, you might ask? Well, it turns out they are a company called Rico Elemex, a Japanese manufacturer of fine measuring equipment, watches, and photocopiers, and they're actually still around. I don't think I've ever seen another game from them, so I guess their little excursion into the world of video game publishing was pretty short-lived. Well, how exactly did Hudson get involved in this? No idea, but it turns out Hudson hardly wasted a top-shelf game with Rixsoft. Unfortunately, Shin Jinrui reminds me of nothing other than Square's god-awful King's Knight. I don't know why, but ground-based shoot-em-ups never seem to work. Your character seems much more mobile if it's a spaceship or an airplane or something that can fly. Now granted, Shin Jinrui is not nearly as irritating as King's Knight, but it's certainly not very much fun either, though of course I guess the little boomerang weapon is kind of cool. There are the typical power-ups, your little fists, speed-ups, that sort of thing. Now here's the part that I hate, jumping over bodies of water. Instant death if you fall in, and it's really easy to fall in. I guess I'll try it another time here. And of course you lose all your power-ups, should you happen to die. Now I guess there are actually a couple interesting things about this game. The character and the stone axe weapon seem taken almost right out of Hudson's Adventure Island. I guess they didn't want to bother coming up with any actual new ideas for this. And the name, Shin Jinrui, literally the new breed. It's a term used to describe affluent post-war Japanese youth. Maybe it also has some sort of meaning connected to Neolithic mankind? Oh yeah, and there's also that hunk of meat power-up that sort of resembled something that was later found in the Bonk games by Hudson Soft. Hudson seems to have sort of a thing for cavemen. In the US, this was released by Hudson themselves as The Adventures of Dino Riki, where it pretty much failed to make any sort of lasting impression. What is Hero no Ken? Well, naturally the question is answered in the game's introduction. So begin Culture Brain's Hero no Ken, known in the US as Flying Dragon, the Secret Scroll, an entirely appropriate name since the game has you hunting down some important magical scrolls or something like that. Hero no Ken is Culture Brain's second Famicom release, after Super Chinese back in mid-1986, so it seems they have a thing for Kung Fu themed games. Just like Super Chinese, Hero no Ken is based on an earlier arcade game. Another thing the two games have in common is that they're both a little clunky, ugly, and just generally unappealing. While Culture Brain wasn't producing quickie knockoff games, they were making games that were just didn't seem quite right. Not that this game isn't without its merits, but it is a little weird considering that the first boss is a little girl with purple hair who's approximately the same size as you. If nothing else, this game has a lot of things that don't exactly make a whole lot of sense. The original arcade game, Shanghai Kid from 1986, was completely different. It was an early fighting game with a rather unique system. Red targets would appear indicating your enemy's weak spot, or when the enemy was going to strike you, your weak spot. You would then try to strike the weak spot, or defend, depending on the situation. Now the Famicom game is actually sort of a platformer / beat-em-up. Culture Brain completely rethought the game, adding a storyline about an evil kung fu clan you must defeat, and sticking in these rather lame platforming sequences in between fights. And the platforming sections are definitely the weak spots. You fight a never-ending parade of brainless punk rocker dudes, with these weird boss fights sprinkled in. Nothing here much makes sense. The background starts flashing during the boss fights for no reason. The music changes constantly and sometimes just stops completely. The boss fights are completely bizarre. We already saw the little girl, and there's a guy who looks kind of like an overgrown Jawa, and so on. And everything's sort of hastily thrown together in sort of a spastic sort of game. Now once you complete the first level, you then go through a rather lengthy tutorial on the fighting game mechanic, complete with lots of exposition here from Master Wan. And doesn't Master Wan seem like sort of strange name for a Chinese guy? This shows exactly how the attack and defend mechanism works. One thing about Hero no Ken, there is a lot of text breaking up the action sequences. Master Wan is a really talkative guy. This game has way more explanatory dialogue than any other Famicom game I can think of, so it was sort of like the Metal Gear Solid of its time. Eventually you will make your way to the fighting competition. Of course there's another platforming level in between this, and the enemies and bosses on every level are pretty much exactly the same. During the fighting sequence, the game essentially becomes Shanghai Kid. You battle a series of enemies and must defeat each one, the last enemy in each round being the toughest. Now the actual Hero no Ken move is where you sort of swirl around and do like a spinning kick, like I just did right there. Reasonably tricky to get it to connect, but it's pretty powerful. And from here on, the pattern repeats. Now Hero no Ken is a pretty unique game. There aren't many platformer / one-on-one fighting hybrid games, and the platforming sections I suppose do sort of break up the monotony of the fighting game sections, but like a lot of kitchen sink type games, it lacks consistency and isn't really very satisfying to play. Again, let's fire up ye old FDS, which is now 1 year old, for a new Konami game. But this is something different from Konami. It's Esper Dream, an RPG. And in some ways, Esper Dream is the first 100% Japanese RPG to be released after the Dragon Quest games. Valkyrie was almost more or less a Zelda clone, and Deep Dungeon was a completely old-fashioned US-style dungeon crawler, whereas Esper Dream is more of a traditional Japanese-style action RPG. And check out this very nice intro, which actually kicks off the story's narrative. Still relatively uncommon for an introduction to do this back then. Like pretty much all Japanese RPGs at this time, in Esper Dream you control a single protagonist. Dragon Quest II had just introduced multiple characters into Japanese RPGs. Like Dragon Quest, Esper Dream starts you off in a village and with some guy who explains your quest. A lot of adventure games, like Zelda for example, just sort of started you off in the middle of nowhere, whereas this game sort of eases you into the plot. Of course, we have the usual FTS side switching and wait times here. The plot apparently involves some sort of kidnapped girl that you have to rescue. Obviously that's pretty standard for the time. And you generally begin the game by walking around the village, talking to various NPCs, who give you some sort of idea of what you're actually supposed to be doing in the game. And of course this guy gives you the very basic equipment. And as you can see here, the village actually looks very nice. You actually have sort of real houses and whatnot, rather than the rather more abstract castles and towns of Dragon Quest. Now, Esper Dream is actually sort of a weird inversion of the typical Dragon Quest world layout. Rather than exiting the village and traveling across the globe, the various worlds in this game are accessed through houses contained inside the village itself. These are the gray houses. The other houses are just where NPCs live. Sometimes they give you helpful hints, sometimes they just say a bunch of nonsense. We'll go ahead and enter the first dungeon here, and this setup is some sort of like oversized room with giant slippers, block sets, and countertops. And it's hard to say really exactly what's going on here. For example, why does your character suddenly put on a little weird horned helmet whenever he goes into a battle scene? Now, unlike your typical Zelda clone, this game has separate battle screens, and you find yourself locked in a room with several enemies. You then have to kill them all in order to exit. Your enemies will drop experience points and cash, and as you may have seen there, the hit detection can be a bit weird at times. You can see the enemies walking around on the overworld, or rather you can see their footprints, which look sort of like dog prints or something, despite the fact that most of the enemies would not leave prints like that. Now every world has a few dungeons. In this case, the dungeons are entered through the computer screens, and they look sort of like, I guess, the insides of computers here. I guess you're shrinking down really small or something. Each dungeon has at least one object, maybe a power-up or a quest object of some sort, such as the ring that you'll see. And also one dungeon in each world will have a boss. Now Esper Dream does have some rather pre-Dragon Quest elements to it. For example, just like Ultima 3, leveling up only raises your hit points and magic points. In order to raise your attack and defense, you need to purchase the incredibly overpriced weapons and armor found in the shops. Enemies will always give you experience points, but they don't always drop money, represented by the little coin purses that you see lying around. And usually you don't get very much, maybe 1 to 10 gold for the early enemies. Here's the first boss right here. It's hard to say really what sort of themes this game is based on. Most of the enemies are bugs and fishes, yet this guy is some kind of living plant. And you saw me getting the capsule here, something you need to collect after each boss, though what exactly they're supposed to be I'm not sure. Oh, and here you can see what I mean by the items being overpriced. At maybe an average of 5 pieces of gold per enemy, it's going to take you a while to buy that leather armor. Now there isn't any sort of customization available, your character will simply obtain certain magic spells automatically after reaching the right level. Now one thing that can make this game a little difficult is the lack of healing items. The only way you can heal yourself is to spend a night at the inn, which is a little expensive at 100 gold, but there aren't any sort of health items or magic refill items. Now occasionally enemies will drop something that will refill your health or magic, but these are pretty rare. In fact, in the second half of the game, I think I encountered like maybe literally 2 or 3 of them. Pretty much the only thing you actually be buying in the game, other than weapons and armor, are keys, which are used to unlock some of the doors and dungeons. Now there are 5 different worlds in this game, each with about maybe 4 dungeons each, and often with a village. So in other words, there's a main village, inside that are houses with little worlds inside of them, and inside those are more houses with villages inside of them. And the worlds are actually linked to each other, so that this sort of gives you shortcuts between the different worlds, so you have to go to the main village each time. Now, Esper Dream has a rather perplexing theme to it. Rather than a medieval setting or a fantasy setting like Dragon Quest, this is sort of a storybook setting, with odd things thrown in like a bazooka weapon or robot enemies. And the enemies themselves are often quite odd. Here's these ducks I mentioned when discussing King Kong 2. Konami has a thing for killer ducks, it seems. But the enemies are ducks, crabs, insects, chess pieces, and occasionally weird things like robots or various bizarre things like disembodied hands. Now this game certainly has its good qualities. The graphics are very nice and crisp and detailed. It's certainly a better looking game than Dragon Quest. Oh, here of course is the ice world, something that would become a very common theme in later games. On the negative side, the battle sequences can be a little clunky and often just don't feel right. The NPC interactions are pretty insipid, and I was never really sure why I was really doing anything. There's objects you need to complete the game, but you never really know why. This is a little frustrating. The enemies use these sort of directionless flash attacks. You just saw one there. That'll shave off like, oh, a good 50 points off your health, and there's no way you can avoid them or defend against them. Esper Dream does start getting pretty tricky towards the end. You'll need to be constantly using magic such as the shield magic or the time stop magic in order to defeat enemies. And since they have that flash magic which you have no defense against, you're going to lose HP and magic points for pretty much every enemy you fight. Now since you can't heal or refill your magic, going through these dungeons is less about strategy and more about simply having enough MP and HP to actually make it all the way to the end. And quite frankly, some enemies take way too many hits to kill, even with the most powerful weapon. For example, these guys right here, look how many times I have to hit them with a bazooka before they finally die. And of course, after you've purchased all the best armor and weapons in the game, the money really starts pouring in, though of course now there's nothing to actually spend it on. Oddly, Esper Dream is structured more like a platformer than an RPG, with a series of distinct worlds and a boss at the end of each one. This is the last world right here, and it's really tough. The enemies in this level just really pummel you repeatedly. So all in all, Esper Dream is a very creative, very carefully made game, but it's also sort of clumsy and frustrating at the same time. And the combat, well, the controls and the combat scenes really do feel sort of awkward. And a lot of the elements in the game don't really quite gel. Still, you have to give kudos for Konami for getting on the JRPG bandwagon so early. And it's interesting how you can already see certain elements that become standards in JRPGs emerging at this early stage. Esper Dream was certainly never released in the US. This is actually an unofficial translation we're looking at here. While this is not a great game, it's certainly worth taking a look at if you're interested in the history of very early Japanese role-playing games. Take a moment to enjoy this cool title screen. Yes, for the Famicom Disk System, it's Famicom Golf Japan Course. The golf game so epic it needs its own pre-game credits. This game was published by Nintendo, but once again developed by the ever-reliable HAL Laboratory. They must have been busy guys, having released their own game, Eggerland, less than a month earlier. There are various play options, but none of them are really too exciting because, let's face it, this game really isn't that interesting. However, the original Nintendo Golf from 1984 was one of the biggest sellers for the Famicom in Japan, supposedly selling more copies than Legend of Zelda and Metroid put together, if you can believe that. So naturally, a sequel was in order. Here is the original Golf right here. Nowadays, some folks complain about certain sports series, such as the Madden football games, saying that each new entry is just a slight update to the earlier games, and they really keep putting them out only on a regular basis to keep the money pouring in. Well, I suppose Nintendo started that trend with this game, because as you can see, it's just a slight update on the original 1984 Golf game. The basic gameplay is identical, though it has been given a graphic and musical overhaul. The original Golf had no music during the game, just sound effects. As before, you pick your club, use your arrow to determine how strong and accurate the swing will be, and swing the club to hit the ball. In this case, I once again get it in the water. Probably the most interesting question in this game is, who's this guy? Obviously he's not Mario nor Luigi. Do they have a third brother? He's better than me, that's for sure. Incredibly, Nintendo released a follow-up to this game only 4 months later. And yes, Bandai has a golf game coming up before too long as well. Overall, golf games are very popular on the Famicom, and there are probably more of them released than any other sports game. At last, it's another game in Bandai's Family Trainer series, Aerobics Studio, released in the US by Nintendo as Dance Aerobics. Now with added synthesized speech. Though I'm not really sure how I feel about the enormous sweat drops flying off the logo. It's a little disgusting. If nothing else, Dance Aerobics is notorious for the hilariously dated cover. Yeah, that's how you were supposed to dress for aerobics back then. And what the hell's that guy in the middle left box doing? There was an aerobics craze back in the mid-80s, so naturally there had to be a family trainer / power pad game to cash in. You have a number of options, including some basic aerobic steps. You start off with a nice little warm-up here. You always gotta remember to stretch and warm up before you start exercising. And then of course it's basically just your standard follow the leader type game. The one thing I do like about the game is the fact that apparently your exercise room is some sort of gigantic $10 million loft in a New York City high-rise. Maybe this is supposed to be Flashdance inspired. The main part of the game here has sort of repeated routines, but there's also other games where I think they're more random. But they're all sort of the same kind of follow the leader, Simon Says type games. Or, as she even points out, follow me. Hard to say if this game actually got any housewives or kids actually doing aerobics. There's also sort of a music-oriented Simon Says-like game which has you jumping around and hitting musical notes. As you can see there, like all the family trainer games, Dance Aerobics is developed by a human who does, technically a pretty good job putting this thing together. Now, all of this has led some to call Dance Aerobics maybe the very first dance-based rhythm game, sort of like a predecessor to Dance Dance Revolution, those sorts of things. This might be true, but so what? Dance Aerobics is still not a very exciting game. Over the course of Chrontendo, we've seen good games as well as many bad games, but we've also seen a lot of games that fall into that vast middle ground. Games that are neither good nor bad, but that simply exist. Bandai's Pocket Zaurus Ju Ouken no Nazo is a quintessential example of such a title. Developed by, who else? Toza, the notorious and somewhat secretive Japanese contract developer, Pocket Zaurus is a completely typical, straight-ahead platformer. According to this opening, this nebbishy-looking character gets transformed into a little dinosaur, and then has to travel back in time to the year 100 million BC, smack dab in the middle of the Cretaceous period, when dinosaurs ruled the Earth. He then uses his little boomerang to fight his way across the landscape, presumably in order to rescue a princess of some sort. The side-scrolling platform genre, which was introduced to the Famicom about a year and a half earlier, Super Mario Bros., was in its difficult and formative years. Most platformers released during this time period were pretty basic, and not too many deviated from the standard formula. It wasn't too long before we see some advances in the platform genre. Games like Mega Man and Bionic Commando introduced some exciting new concepts, but in the meantime we are mostly stuck with games like Pocket Zaurus. If nothing else, I guess it's interesting that even as a dinosaur you still wear glasses and a bow tie. Now Toza does try to liven up a bit by adding sort of a short, rather lame shoot-'em-up sequence, as seen here. The hit detection seems a little off at times. Strangely, this enormous dinosaur which we're flying over does seem to resemble that from a later, much better platform game, Bonk. In a slight variation of the shoot the eye theme, you actually kill this dinosaur by firing one shot into the nostril, which we'll see in just a few moments here. And of course, avoid the spider webs which are mysteriously floating in the air and around the dinosaur. Like a lot of Toza games of this time, there's a lot of elements here that really don't make much sense. Oh yeah, you can't shoot the eye. One hit to the nostril will do the job. It is a rather bizarre way to kill a boss, I suppose. Now eventually our hero will go underground and battle a set of more bizarre, unusual monsters, including these sort of annoying mole creatures that dig fatal holes in the ground. This boss battle isn't too bad, I suppose. Nothing we haven't seen before. I do admit that there's a pretty weird, cool background during this scene. In terms of power-ups, you will eventually acquire a little dinosaur battle suit that restores all your health. Oh yeah, and there's those arched windows inside an underground cavern. Granted, Pocket Zaurus does have a little bit of character to it. The ending is unique. You rescue the princess and transform back into your human form, but then it turns out the princess is the demon that transformed you into a dinosaur to begin with, and then she turns you back into a dinosaur before flying away. So while Pocket Zaurus is better than games like Ultraman, it still fails to hold much interest today. Here's another release from Sunsoft. Actually, one of two releases this episode, and two more next episode. They're really cranking them out. Sunsoft definitely has some quality issues with their releases, but this particular title is a little different than most. Marchen Veil is a port of the 1985 PC-88 game from System Famicom, a game company not really known for quality releases, at least at this point. They will eventually release some games for the Famicom themselves later on. Now, Marchen Veil apparently is somewhat well remembered by some Japanese gamers as being an early RPG with a somewhat well-delineated plot. The story is told as a series of text and image tableaus, as we see here, at the beginning of each level, and they're labeled visual stages, for some strange reason. Now, oddly, the game's title is given as both the nonsensical Marchen Veil and Marchen Veil on different screens. Marchen is German for fairy tale, but what a Marchen Veil is, I have absolutely no idea. The original PC-88 version was apparently thought to have unusually well done art for the time, but there's certainly nothing well done about the art in this version. Marchen Veil is usually classified by Japanese gamers as an action RPG, but in reality it is merely a pre-Zelda action-adventure game with some fantasy elements thrown in. Kind of similar to Hudson's Challenger game, also from 1985, which we saw back in Chrontendo Episode 5. Now, this Famicom version, which was perhaps ported by Sunsoft themselves, suffers from kind of choppy scrolling and character movement. Honestly, you would think that by 1987 developers would have mastered the technical skills required for smooth scrolling on the Famicom, but apparently Sunsoft had not. Interestingly, there was a Marchen Veil 2, but it was never ported to the Famicom unless this version actually contains both parts. So Marchen Veil is a bit of a mess, but still sort of fascinating looking title. It certainly might be worth a closer look if anyone ever decides to translate it. Here we have another of those oddball Japanese releases we all love, Ikinari Musician. For a game about music, isn't it weird that there's no music in the title screen? And Ikinari Musician is not a game, but rather a sort of virtual synthesizer / music program, and one with a rather weird, arbitrary rabbit theme. The game was released by the educational game specialist, Tokyo Shoseki. We've seen their educational games on the Famicom before, and presumably developed by these guys mentioned on the title screen, Musical Plan Limited, whoever the hell they are. Their name also appears on one of the more infamous FDS games, Santa Claus no Takarabako. We'll be covering that game probably around episode 22 or so. Now, Ikinari Musician functions much like any very basic keyboard of the era. You have a few different instrument choices, some built-in demo tracks, and you can play over and use the D-pad to actually move the cursor around and play the keyboard itself. Moving the cursor up around through the control will allow you to change things, instrument type, so on and so forth. Immediately above the keyboard there's various selections that let you control sort of the quality of the sound. For example, give it sort of like a tremolo effect or whatnot. You can also affect how fast the notes are, 8 notes versus quarter notes, and so on and so forth. And there are also, as I mentioned, pre-programmed tracks of different genres. You can select these by going to the map, though apparently country and western comes from Los Angeles, or maybe even Baja, according to this map. And again, what exactly is up with the damn rabbits? Ah yes, northern Quebec, land of the boogie. So for an individual such as myself with no musical training or talent, this is just a rather silly noise-making toy. Though for someone with some actual musical skills, they could probably, in theory, make some cool little Famicom-style musical tracks with this thing. You can record and play back your creations using the mic and reel-to-reel tape icons on the right-hand side. But anyone can certainly fool around with it for a little while and amuse themselves. We'll start up the FDS here. And we'll just enjoy the music for a sec. Probably won't enjoy the game itself too much. And it's Super Lode Runner, a game which appears to be based on this 1986 Irem arcade title, sometimes referred to as Lode Runner 4 in the US. The levels of this arcade game were reused in Super Lode Runner for the Famicom. Now at this time, Irem was having some dealings with the US computer giant Broderbund. You might recall they released Spelunker for the Famicom, and they had in fact acquired the rights for the Lode Runner franchise for Japanese use. Thus, they started making their very own Lode Runner arcade games. Super Lode Runner, and this does show that they were releasing games with the word Super in the title, well before the Super Famicom came out. Super Lode Runner is Irem's first Lode Runner game for the Famicom. They would also release a sequel, Super Lode Runner 2. So, what's the game itself like? Well, it's pretty much just another Lode Runner game. The third for the Famicom after Lode Runner and Championship Lode Runner. It adheres pretty strictly to the Lode Runner formula, but you'll notice the sprites have changed. The robots from the original Lode Runner for the Famicom by Hudson no longer look like Bomberman. Presumably Hudson owned the sprite design from their earlier Lode Runner games. The idea is to collect gold and avoid the enemies. You can dig holes that will temporarily stop the enemies. After you've gotten all the gold, a little ladder will appear and you climb up to the next level. And that's all there is to it. You just keep repeating. I think altogether there's around 55 levels on this game. Though of course these beginning levels here are pretty basic. They do get much weirder and much more complicated and much more puzzlish in later levels. Since these games were not developed by the original creators of Lode Runner, I'm not really sure how the Irem titles are thought of by Lode Runner fans. I assume they sold okay in Japan, since Lode Runner was apparently enormously popular over there. Our last game this episode is Mickey Mouse, and this is the third licensed title from Hudson, after the dull Ninja Hattori-kun and the unspectacular Doraemon. But unlike those titles, this one is based on a property that is huge pretty much everywhere in the world, Disney's Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse, or Mickey Mouse Big Adventure in Wonderland to give the full title, is definitely subpar Hudson. They don't really seem to put too much effort into the licensed titles, but it is sometimes fun and sometimes frustrating little platformer consisting of 5 levels. You control Mickey while Minnie follows behind you, and the first thing you want to do is to get some firepower. Once this is done, you'll be able to blast enemies and find the occasional hidden item like the little Hudson bee there. Often hitting windows will cover an extra life, though in this game you'll need to fire at pretty much everything in sight. Now you might notice in this game that some of the sprites seem a little familiar, like those little spiders there seem right of Adventure Island. And Hudson did sort of on occasion reuse some of their sprites. Now this was not the first Mickey Mouse game. There was Sorcerer's Apprentice on the Atari 2600, and there's also a title called Mickey Mouse Athletic World for the rather obscure Japanese console, the Tomy Puta. But this is pretty much the first in a series of very popular games based on Disney characters released for the Famicom. Well, going back to the game in question, in this first level you sort of navigate around these little rooms here, mostly looking for a key, so you can get out the door found at the very beginning of the level. Here's the first boss, the Cheshire Cat. Now this game is more or less based around Alice in Wonderland. The object is to actually rescue Alice, and a lot of the enemies and bosses are based on Alice in Wonderland characters. Now playing the game on this first level here, you might think Mickey Mouse is sort of a kid's game and seems pretty simple, not really too difficult. Compared to something like Milon's Secret Castle, Mickey Mouse seems like a cakewalk. But after the first level, the difficulty starts steadily increasing. This second level requires far more advanced jumping and enemy dodging skill, and Mickey Mouse just gets harder from here on out. In this level, it's quite easy to mistime your jumps and have Minnie land in the ocean. Remember, of course, she always follows right behind you, and of course you have sort of the thing where as you jump, enemies and waves start flying at you. Now in Japan, Hudson Soft released this game themselves, but by the time its US version came out, Capcom had apparently already obtained the rights to the Disney license, resulting in Mickey Mouse being released by Capcom as Mickey Mousecapade. Here's the US version title screen. Notice it still says Mickey Mouse. They didn't bother changing the title screen that much, but they did change most of the enemy sprites and all of the bosses. As a result, Mickey Mousecapade is much less Alice in Wonderland based. Note the snakes there, which seem again taken right out of Adventure Island. The game itself is pretty much identical other than the sprites. For example, the first boss here apparently is, well, perhaps the witch from Snow White. Mickey Mousecapade uses a wider variety of Disney villains. Now here's an odd part. Minnie can actually get kidnapped by one enemy and you have to sort of find her among all these various Minnie Mouse statues. You need to collect her before you could actually exit the first level. By the third level, the games start getting a bit more sinister and difficult. Here's the third level boss, the Caterpillar. This is again the Japanese version. Pretty tough and kind of similar to the bosses in Milon's Secret Castle. Now level 4 is even more sadistic. It's based on Neverland from Peter Pan, and it's an incredibly short level, only 4 screens, but the villain, Captain Hook, is virtually impossible to defeat as he throws basically a solid ball of knives at you. In the US version, which was released by Capcom again, they've changed the villain to Pegleg Pete. It was sort of a standard Mickey Mouse enemy. So, Mickey Mouse is sort of a strange little game, definitely not Hudson's best by any means, but definitely a lot more difficult than you think it might be, and it's definitely worth taking a look. Thanks a lot for watching Chrontendo episode 15. The next thing we'll be releasing is actually episode 2 of Chron Sega. This will cover through around early 1987 and will allow us to pretty much be sort of caught up with the Famicom. Shortly thereafter we'll have Chrontendo episode 16, which will feature, well, a couple more pretty good Konami games, as well as the usual crap from people like Sunsoft and Takara, and also a couple early Square releases. We'll also have one of our very brief little features, this one on the state of video games in the mid-80s. So we'll see you then.